Thank you so much. It's really ironic that I've been spending most of my adult life working in the education or learning world, especially since I spent most of my high school getting kicked out of class. And ironically, I also had a parent that was a mad scientist. He was a propulsions engineer, and he taught us to take risks, innovate, and blow up classrooms. And I think about it today. Today, I'd be barred from going to school, and so having the opportunity to be focused on learning is a pleasure of mine, but it's also something where it needs to be seated in the realities of how we work and how we have to be continuous learners. And so I want to take you through a quick history of learning. So it's interesting because first, learning and the GDP are usually tied together. They're inextricably tied together because innovation and the health of the economies of countries are tied to how our learners are learning. And obviously, the first 500 years that we started to measure this, there wasn't much education going on, or formal education. But then we started having education in the private sector, and so heliocentrism was invented between 1500 and 1600. But that happened because there was a battle going on between religion and science and exploration. So in order to have exploration, we needed to have mathematics and science. And so education started to move beyond the religious orders and started to become more public. And Isaac Newton started to bring mathematics out there. And as we became more global, we started having to invent things. And so machines started to be invented, so the first adding machine. Then we really got into the first industrial revolution and modernization of manufacturing, and we had the printing press and capitalism, which spurred the American and French revolutions. And then, of course, the second industrial revolution. So for about 150 years, we've had the assembly line working, industrial systems, and then we also had assembly line education. And then what happened here? Communication and the internet started to grow like crazy. And what you see is that globalization actually is a product of innovation. And the problem that we're now having is that innovation is in need of reinvention, because what's scary to most countries right now is that there's a flattening of enough people, enough labor that can force change within corporations so that they can reinvent themselves. And so you see that in these numbers that there isn't so much a digital divide. Everybody has now one of these or some form of a way to communicate. So what we see now, too, is that there's this rise of content. So the more that there is technology and more communication, the more content that's being created. So the sum of human knowledge now can be accessed at your fingertips through one of these devices. It's astounding, but there's so much noise still. And within that noise, how do you make sense of all of this? And that's what Declara does. What we have done is looked at all of this content, tried to really understand the end user. So accessibility is happening worldwide. I've worked in Africa, setting up technologies there many years ago, and now those technologies are growing like crazy. You can find interesting technologies everywhere. I was in India, and I was in a cab, and I was looking out the window one day, and there was a guy on a water buffalo just in what it looked like underwear. He put his hands in his underwear, and out came an iPhone. And I thought, wow, that is ironic. I mean, think about it. You have modernity crashing with post-modernity right now. So technology is everywhere. Soon there's going to be 5 billion people connected online. Right now, we've had just with the iPhone alone, 60 billion downloads of apps. Unbelievable. They're right in the United States alone. We have 4 million Wikipedia articles that have been written. And then we have 1 trillion web pages. So tons and tons of content. But how do we make sense of that? It's not just making sense of it, it's also understanding that all of this accessibility changes your brain. So by trade, by education, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm very interested in how we're being transformed. We're changed every time that we pull out a device and we look at a device and we start to interact with it. And our young people are changed. So I'm going to show you some data just on 12 to 17-year-olds. It's fascinating to understand that with all of this content out there, our students are 95% of our 12 to 17-year-olds are online. And I was looking at, and our platform is in Mexico, and I was fascinated to learn that by the time somebody is 12 years old, a boy 12 years old in Mexico, they've already done written 250,000 emails. Now imagine that in the United States, where we've had access to the internet quite a bit longer. So 76% are using social networks. 77% have cell phones. But the number is much bigger for 19 to 29-year-olds. So 97% of us have, I'm not in that group, I can promise you that, but 97% of the 19 to 20-year-old, 29-year-olds have a cell phone and are using that daily. That's huge. The world has changed on us. However, we're still leaving people behind. And I'm going to bring up some of these statistics. It's interesting because we have 70% of the people that are in prison today are illiterate. And it's even worse that 90% of the people that have been tested in prison suffer from innumeracy. So for whatever reason, they haven't been accessing learning like the rest of us, and what that has done is resulted in a warehousing of people. And 47 million Americans today are on food stamps. And just a few years ago, it was only 42 million Americans. So even though, you know, I live in Silicon Valley and it's booming, there are a lot of Americans, 1/6 of the Americans in the United States are living in poverty. So what does this mean? So what if we could change what happens with learning? What if we could provide access to people? So you'll see that the taxes that could go back into bringing people back into jobs, the savings around the costs in health care, mental health care, prisons, social care, and also the earnings that can come back. We could bring so much more back into this country if we'd invest in learning. And I'm not talking about just education, because you'll look at this in this data, and you're probably getting the idea that I'm a bit of a data head, that this data is looking at the United States isn't so much not educating its kids. It's just that the standards for entry-level jobs have gone up. And up to now, the HR systems in our companies have been excellent at really identifying great employees, but we have fallen behind in educating all of our students. Just 40 years ago, Korea looked much like Afghanistan looks like today, and yet they become #1 in bringing entry-level workers into the workforce. And the way that they did that is they stopped trying to reform a book-based system, and they handed these kinds of technologies to their kids and digitized their learning for them. So they've created a much more reflexive and flexible workforce by educating people. So this looks like the classroom I learned in, and you know, you can see how excited everybody in this picture is. So when I was in Australia, this is what most of the classrooms look like. They're engaged, they're innovative. In fact, one of these kids walked up to me and said, "What is it like to be in the United States and to work in a classroom with a book? What does that feel like to you?" And I was surprised, because I'd always thought the United States was driving much further forward faster. But learning is changing. You know, we started out with having a shortage of content, where I remember growing up, and probably many of the older people in here remember growing up, where the libraries were where you went to go get knowledge, that your teachers were the people who provided the knowledge. The sage on the stage were the people who knew things, but no longer. So there had been a shortage of access to knowledge. Now there's an abundance of knowledge, and that knowledge is pointed through curation. So a lot of this curation creates something called metadata around content, because you're learning about people and how they're learning and what's important, who is bubbling up to be an expert. And when you think about what's happening around us all the time, we have this opposition, or these opposing forces, where we're trying to assess and test our way into success. And in the end, I think that what we're doing in our classrooms is actually walking away from learning. So learning isn't about testing. Testing is a point-in-time measurement. Learning is something that is ongoing and should be something that is context-aware. So Declara is very context-aware. We look at the metadata, and we look at the world around us, and we look at the abundance of content. And then we realize that there are 3 billion people that are connected online today. Imagine that, 3 billion people, 3 billion teachers. We should be looking across each other and really understanding what that means. And that's why we really believe that learning is around finding and engaging in discovery and curiosity. So our formula for change is really understanding the metadata. Metadata is, and it's hard to understand sometimes, but it's the data about data. When you are metacognitive, you're thinking, it's really understanding, thinking about how you think. So that's what metadata means. And metadata is essentially our future. It's our current resource. For me, it's gold, because it tells us everything that you do, how things are curated, and this is how you can get to assessments. Really understanding and following how people are learning, who they learn from, who's bubbling up as an expert, what content's becoming an expert. And then really understanding how we are all working together. The APIs today allow us to collect context. So instead of having to be the inventor of platforms that do X, Y, and Z, now the beauty of learning is that we can connect into multiple platforms through APIs that allow us to get context of users and context of need during the work life and free life. So during pleasure, what do you want to learn? What do you want to read? What do you need? All of those are pieces of data that we're able to access, and then to really create a learning pathway. For us, we believe that we need to break through the brick and mortar and liberate learning, liberate the opportunity for you to learn anywhere at any time. So that's what differentiates us from the regular learning in the classrooms or regular e-learning platforms. Also, we leave assessments behind, because the way that you're interacting with content, experts, other learners, and how you're exploring the world within your work life and your personal life tells us the 360-degree view of who you are. We also find that people should be creating their learning pathways, that we should be broadening and helping people understand the context of their own learning, and that as learners, you're going to be exploring and expanding and contracting your pathway. And we want people to be guided by their curiosity, not just needs and being demanded to learn something, but understanding that sometimes we take an orthogonal path away from what we're told we need to learn, and that's where true innovation happens. So we believe that in this on-demand library, and what we're doing in Declara is creating the ability to access this on-demand library. The world is filled with content, And what we need to be doing is figuring out ways to allow that content to surface itself to you in a timely manner, in ways that are going to make it possible for you to be a continuous learner. So mobile devices are now connecting us to the sum of human knowledge. And with all these people online, 3 billion today, 5 billion people by 2020. Imagine the access to teachers that you can have anywhere and any time. We want to flip us from being flat on the paper or just a push technology at learning, but actually make learning smart. It should be predictive, it should be connected, and it should be context aware. Learning should understand, our systems should understand when you are trying to learn for work. For instance, our platforms being used in Genentech so that people can actually get to understand and connect resources worldwide that they may not be able to find. So how do you surface experts that are working on the same molecule if they're not in the same company or in the same building or in the same country? And how do you find who's working on a molecular store, the same kind of genotype as you, somewhere hidden out there, and how do we pull that all together? And that's really by understanding context and by surfacing those experts so that they can work better, faster, and try to reduce the costs to coming up with cancer agents. And so that's what our work is doing right now in Genentech. Most of our work, however, happens in countries like Mexico, Australia, Singapore, the United States coming this spring. But also what's very important for us is really the content and the social learning. All of us are learning from each other, and that data is never really truly captured. So how do you do that? And with our platform, we're very interested in how learning is happening between that social interaction. And much of that information is ignored or not pulled in. So we look at a lot of unstructured data because data and learning is very hard to structure. So we are using a lot of machine learning to be able to pull this off. So what our machine learning is doing is looking at clusters of or replicating clusters of neurons. So in your brain solves problems and expands on things and connects to other neurons based on how it's trying to solve problems. And so what we do is replicate that sort of technology within our platform to look at everything that's happening, how learning is happening with all of our users and what's happening with the metadata around content. And we leverage this deeper learning. And what's fascinating about this is that the algorithms themselves learn as it goes. So we're not having to go in and manually reconfigure this kind of technology, but the technology learns by learning from other people. So our platform learns as you learn and gets smarter and better and faster. So I'm going to end this, and I really thank you so much. And what's exciting for me is that we're now moving not just from being an enterprise company, but becoming more of a consumer company so that we can help people anywhere, anytime. What's exciting about that for a company like Declara is the ability to reinvent itself, to undo even its own marketing system so that we can become better at learning ourselves. And so I just really want to thank you for your time. Thank you.